This lecture identifies the work of Friedrich Nietzsche as a pivotal moment in the process of cultural mutation that we've been tracing in the identity of the hero and the saint as models for the human search for meaning, and especially during the period of the transition from the Enlightenment to the 20th century. Nietzsche, like Kierkegaard, Marx, Darwin, and Freud, whom we looked at in the last lecture, suspects that beneath the progressive optimism of the Enlightenment lies an unresolved crisis of irreconcilable differences between these two figures, the hero and the saint, and that the impetus toward conversion that we've examined as the dynamic of European civilization from the time of the Roman Empire up to the Enlightenment, now clearly, in the view of these figures, is headed toward a catastrophe. The progressive developments in Western culture brought about by the dynamics that we looked at in our recent lectures, liberal democratic individualism, empirical scientific method, and capitalism, all assumed, as we have seen, the impersonal worldview of heroic virtue. All of those dynamics are enactments of that worldview and of the heroic figure that is exemplary of its virtues. At the same time, however, we've seen that the defense of social values, public morality, and the hope of personal and societal transcendence were all based during this period on the worldview and cultural legacy of scriptural religion. The precise suspicion each of the figures that we've been looking at recently have is focused on the idea that at some point, the bubble of Enlightenment optimism, an optimism for progress toward an ideal integration of the values of saint and hero, would burst, carrying with it cultural upheaval and, in some cases, a sense of a society in crisis in such a way that all values could easily disappear. It's Nietzsche who most dramatically predicts the coming crash of Western cultural values by declaring the death of God. His most famous pronouncement, the idea that is most immediately associated with the name of Nietzsche in most people's minds. Because Nietzsche is most widely identified with this proclamation of the death of God, and because he willingly and gleefully calls himself the apocalyptic Antichrist, he's viewed by many people as a nihilist and a destructive figure. Furthermore, the alarming details of Nietzsche's troubled personal life, culminating in his descent into madness, are frequently interpreted as proof that Nietzsche's philosophy is corrosive, even sociopathic, proto-fascist, and ultimately, in the eyes of some, simply insane. One of the purposes in this lecture is to try to counteract that view as fully and decisively as we can. I want to propose that the figure of Zarathustra, from Nietzsche's best-known work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was published between 1883 and 1885. The figure of Zarathustra offers a fully plausible and arguably compelling alternative view to the one I just described of Nietzsche's role in the evolution of the human search for meaning. That in some sense, Zarathustra is a model for the new hero, the hero of a new age, which Nietzsche hopes would succeed the breakdown of the decadent values of Western society. Zarathustra represents the first detailed sketch of the figure that will be the focus and center of our consideration of the evolution of the search for meaning in the 20th century, the figure of the secular saint. Now, this is the first time we're introducing this notion of the secular saint, and I am simply gesturing toward the contribution that Nietzsche will make to this figure, but suffice it to say for now that the notion of the secular saint will be our guiding metaphor, our heuristic clue, as we trace our way into and through the 20th century. Zarathustra is both the fullest literary expression of Nietzsche's thought and, in an important way, which we want to try to clarify, the realization of Nietzsche's own personal identity as a writer. Zarathustra is the ideal of Nietzsche the writer. Zarathustra embodies the effect Nietzsche hoped that his writing would have on society. Now, we've already mentioned the significance of Nietzsche's first major work. When we looked at Greek tragedy in an earlier lecture, we noted that Nietzsche's first publication, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, in 1872, in many ways captures the genius of that cultural development of tragedy in Greek society more effectively than any study since then. Zarathustra's teaching of the Overman, the famous Übermensch, generally translated either as Superman, Overman, but with the connotation that we'll have to work out gradually as we go, because these terms, too, have contributed to the general prejudice against Nietzsche's thought. So what the Overman represents is a concern we're going to have to explore in the rest of this lecture. But Zarathustra's teaching of the Overman relates directly to Nietzsche's celebration of the Greek conception of the tragic hero. I think that's important and needs emphasis. If we want to understand who Zarathustra is, there are two sources we need to look at: the source of the name, which we'll examine in a moment, but also the origin of the tragic hero as Nietzsche conceived it in his work, The Birth of Tragedy. In the period between the publication of these two works, Birth of Tragedy in 1872 and Zarathustra in 1883, the widespread and devastating criticism of Nietzsche's academic work had irreparably ruined his reputation in German university circles. Furthermore, his health had been progressively deteriorating, making work a constantly unpredictable struggle for him. While it would not be prudent to view the character of Zarathustra in Nietzsche's writing as in any sense autobiographical or see Zarathustra as a surrogate for Nietzsche's own identity, I would propose that the character of Zarathustra does establish the metaphor through which Nietzsche most truthfully creates his own personal identity, as I've said, as a writer. Zarathustra does, in Nietzsche's fiction, what Nietzsche hopes his writing will do, in fact, in the society in which he lives. Nietzsche lived his life as a writer and continues to live for us as a writer in Zarathustra. Zarathustra, the character in Nietzsche's work, had a primary teaching. His principal teaching, central to his identity, is his announcement and revelation of the Übermensch, the Overman, as the one who is to come. And it's important to note here, in putting it that way, is precisely an alternative in Nietzsche's mind, the suggestion of another possibility over and against the figure who is to come, the one who is to come, that is the Messiah in the scriptural tradition of Western religion. So the Overmensch already suggests an alternative to a certain conception of human existence, human society, and human history in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. The Overman is the one who is to come as the future. The Overman is the future toward which human existence, Nietzsche believes, is directed. For Nietzsche, the Overman embodies the fulfillment of the human search for meaning, the form that heroic identity and virtue will take in the time to come. Now, the character of Zarathustra, historically for Nietzsche, is based on the founder of the religion known as Zoroastrianism. Zarathustra, Zoroaster, two different versions of the same name. Zoroaster lived sometime around the 6th century BCE. He's a figure wrapped in a great deal of mystery and historical lack of information. But he probably lived somewhere in Persia or the present-day Iran. The historical Zarathustra taught that the meaning of human life was determined by our participation as human beings in a cosmic struggle of two irreducible principles, which roughly can be translated as truth and falsehood. Now, Nietzsche understood his character Zarathustra not strictly in historical terms, but rather as preaching now, in Nietzsche's own time and place, the culmination of the process begun by the historical Zarathustra. And that process and the culmination of it was a movement beyond good and evil to a joyful participation in the necessary contest between them. Let's pause here a moment just to note that I suggested that these two principles, as Zarathustra conceived them, were truth and falsehood, and a moment ago I said that Nietzsche conceived them as the contest between good and evil. It's important to note that that transition is the transition which Nietzsche sees as the distortion in the evolution of true religion, non-theistic religion, which is introduced by the religions of monotheism, by the scriptural tradition. In the worldview that Zarathustra, the historical figure, shared with the Greek tragic hero, as we have seen, there is no problem of evil. Reality is what it is, and one is either living truthfully in it or falsely in it. What we think of as moral evil is what would be interpreted by Zarathustra and by Nietzsche as simply being false, untrue to what we are as human beings and to our place in reality. So Nietzsche's Zarathustra articulates the movement beyond good and evil in this sense. In order to grasp what must be understood about good and evil, Nietzsche says one must first grasp life and the true nature of all the living. Nietzsche puts it this way: whatever lives, obeys. That is, obeys the necessity which governs all reality. So, he who cannot obey himself is commanded. That is the nature of the living. But, Nietzsche goes on to say, commanding is harder than obeying. Life is nothing but this will to power, that is, the will to self-mastery. Let me read you a passage in which Nietzsche articulates the view of reality that stands behind this very problematic and, again, much abused notion of the will to power, based on that notion of obeying and self-mastery that we just mentioned. In The Will to Power, Nietzsche says, "And do you know what the world is to me? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? This world, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end. A firm, iron magnitude of force that does not grow bigger or smaller, that does not expand itself, but only transforms itself. As a whole, of unalterable size, a household without expenses or loss, but likewise without increase or income, enclosed by nothingness, as if by a boundary, a play of forces and waves of forces, at the same time one and many, increasing here and at the same time decreasing there, out of the simplest forms, striving toward the most complex, out of the stillest, most rigid, coldest forms, toward the hottest, most turbulent, and most self-contradictory. And then again, returning home to the simple, out of this abundance, out of the play of contradictions, back to the joy of concord, blessing itself as that which must return eternally. This, my Dionysian world of the eternally self-creating, the eternally self-destroying. Do you want a name for this world? A solution to all its riddles? This world is will to power and nothing besides. And you yourselves are will to power and nothing besides." Now, I think it important that we listen to Nietzsche speak about this notion of the will to power. On the one hand, because, as I've said, it has been so widely misunderstood and, quite frankly, so widely abused. And at the same time, because it's come so close to capturing, it is the metaphor for the worldview, the whole prism through which reality is regarded for the character of Zarathustra. Human existence has to be understood as inserted into this eternal play of the cosmos, the play of forces, which have no purpose except to play. And to play in that most basic rhythm of the game, the rising and falling, which is the rhythm of the sea, the rhythm of all nature, the rhythm out of which life itself arises. Our very lives depend upon the rising and falling of our blood pressure. Everything in us throbs with this dynamic, which is reality. So the notion of the Overman is defined by Nietzsche's conception of the will to power, with the emphasis that we just heard that the will to power is simply the relentless drive of reality toward self-mastery. Self-mastery for Zarathustra is essentially a game. Serious in a very important way, but serious in a way that's different from work. Self-mastery strives not as a means to an end beyond itself, as work does. You work for a purpose, toward a purpose. But rather, the play of self-mastery strives to fulfill itself as an end in itself, purely for its own sake. It is, in other words, play. Now, opposition is essential for self-overcoming. But this opposition is not a competition. There is, as we heard a moment ago in the quotation, there is no winner or loser in the play of self-mastery. Therefore, the Overman is never identified by victory or domination over others. Here's where the heart of the misconception regarding the Overman arises. The assumption that in order to achieve mastery, it's primarily mastery over another, rather than, as Nietzsche says so clearly, mastery over self. Let me read you from a different source Nietzsche's work, The Gay Science, an elaboration of this concept of self-mastery. Nietzsche puts himself in the position of someone making a New Year's resolution. He says, for the new year, I still live, I still think, I still have to live, for I still have to think. Today, everybody permits himself the expression of his wish and his dearest thought. Hence, I too shall say what it is that I wish for from myself today, and what was the first thought to run across my heart this year. What thought shall be for me the reason, warranty, and sweetness of my life henceforth. I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati. Let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not want to accuse those who accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all and on the whole, someday I wish to be only a yes-sayer. That passage seems to me to be altogether extraordinary, both in itself and in its capacity to reveal the truth about the will to power, at least as Nietzsche understood it. The will to power is ultimately the power to say yes to the beauty of reality as it must be. Amor, the love, fati, of fate, of what is necessary, of what must be, because that's the way reality is. That's the way reality works. This play of forces, the play of forces that plays in us and through us to the point where it can affirm itself. And this is a religious teaching. Not in the sense of a God, but the affirmation of reality as it is. Nietzsche's Overman is neither a prediction of some biological stage of evolution, a future species, nor a teleological goal, an ideal toward which human civilization should consciously strive. It's not a goal which justifies specific values as means to end. The coming of the Overman will come because it is necessary that it must, in order for human existence to survive, but also to thrive. The Overman understands human existence in terms of the exhilaration that Nietzsche spoke of, the exhilaration of always striving to pass over, to pass on, to pass beyond. The Overman struggle is the struggle of life with death. And here we come to the heart of the issue, it seems to me. The ideal of the Overman is not the projection of some societal or individual wish or fantasy. For Nietzsche, it's simply the recognition that life is nothing but passing over, passing on through death to new life. So Zarathustra's teaching of the Overman as self-mastery is inseparable, as we'll try to explain now, is inseparable from his teaching of what he referred to as eternal recurrence. Now, again, this is a topic of ongoing and unending debate among scholars, but Nietzsche's doctrine of the eternal recurrence takes many forms in his writing. And while some understand it as a determinate cosmological doctrine, in other words, thinking that Nietzsche was saying this is the way reality functions at a physical level, I'd suggest that we do better to interpret it as a metaphor which contextualizes the metaphor of the Overman. The metaphorical significance of eternal recurrence is, in a very important way, the same as that of the Overman, just two different sides of the same coin. The eternal recurrence views reality from the perspective which defines reality as a playing field, the site of a game, rather than from the point of view of the player, the Overman, as the playing field. And therefore, because this is the Greek conception of game and play that we've looked at in earlier lectures, we have to immediately remind ourselves, by so situating the Overman in the context of eternal recurrence, Nietzsche is situating that figure in a religious festival celebration, in the sense we've already spoken about it. It is the spirit of the religious celebration of a festival that defines the identity of the Overman and Nietzsche's identity as a writer. One more quotation, this time again from The Gay Science. Nietzsche says, "What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, 'This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, 'You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine'? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and every thing, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight? Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate confirmation and seal? Once again, an extraordinary focusing of attention on the experience in the moment of the most essential dynamism of reality as a whole. This is the meaning of what it means, in other words, to be a yes-sayer. To be ready to say yes to reality exactly as it must occur, so that you would wish nothing more than for the exact sequence of things as they have been to recur again and again and again. No progress. We see here how entirely this concept of the eternal recurrence is meant to repudiate the whole spirit and dynamism of the Enlightenment, built on the hope and the confident belief that things would continue to change for the better. Each day in every way we would get better and better. Nietzsche says no. The affirmation of life requires this discipline of mind that says the present moment as it is the all. In Nietzsche's Overman, we have, as I've suggested, a kind of first draft for one of the components of the metaphor of the secular saint, which will be the focus of the final part of our course. And what will prove of greatest value in the metaphor of the secular saint is not its capacity to answer the question of the meaning of life, but rather its ability to extend that question creatively into our own society and culture. So in concluding this lecture, let me just try to draw out a bit what it is that Nietzsche contributes to this first draft of the secular saint. Nietzsche's specific historical contribution, I would argue, to the human search for meaning is the ironic impact of his wildly rhetorical strategy, the way in which he's constantly goading and pressing and startling and outraging those who read his work. In so doing, he hoped to offer a fully plausible, comprehensive, and compelling alternative way to live a meaningful human life in the emergent historical situation of the 20th century. Alternative to and completely different from any of the preceding centuries, which had been dominated by the syncretism, the attempt to blend the Greek heroic ideal with the virtue ideal of Judeo-Christian Islamic religion. For Nietzsche, his primary concern is to assert you can live life fully, joyfully, affirmatively, and creatively without hope that goes beyond the present moment, without the hope of progress, without the hope of salvation. How can a human being live without hope? Nietzsche says, this is the question that Western society has been avoiding for 2,000 years. And it is that avoidance which Nietzsche believes is about to come crashing down on our heads in a way that will startle us into an awareness that we've tried to avoid as a culture for centuries.